The morning of my son Daniel's wedding should have been one of the happiest days of my life. But instead it became the day I learned exactly how cruel people could be when they believed money defined a man's worth. My wife Helen and I arrived quietly at the Grand Country Club where the ceremony was being held. I wore my only black suit, the same one I had used for funerals, church, and every important moment over the last 15 years. Helen wore a simple blue dress she had spent 2 weeks altering by hand, because we could not afford a new one. We had driven 3 hours in my old pickup truck that rattled like loose tools in a box, and I noticed the valet staring at it, as if we had made a mistake by pulling into the entrance. Still, Helen smiled nervously and squeezed my arm, because she believed today would finally heal the distance that had slowly grown between us and our son after he became successful in the city. Inside the ballroom, everything sparkled with wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, violin music floated through the air, and guests in expensive suits carried glasses of champagne while speaking in low-polished voices. We looked out of place immediately, and people noticed. Some glanced politely away, others openly stared. But none of that hurt as much as what happened next. My daughter-in-law Vanessa walked toward us in her designer wedding gown with 2 bridesmaids beside her. She looked beautiful, but her face hardened the moment she saw Helen. She stopped directly in front of us, looked my wife up and down slowly, and said in a cold voice loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "You're too poor to be here." The room around us seemed to freeze. Helen's face lost all color. I thought perhaps Vanessa was joking badly, but then she continued, "This wedding is elegant. Important people are here. You could have at least dressed appropriately instead of looking like you wandered in from a roadside diner." One bridesmaid laughed quietly. I saw Helen's hands begin trembling. For 40 years that woman had stood beside me through layoffs, debt, sickness, and loss without ever complaining once. And now she was being humiliated in front of strangers by the woman marrying our son. I looked around expecting Daniel to defend his mother, but he stood 20 feet away speaking with investors from his company and pretending not to notice. That silence cut deeper than Vanessa's words. Helen whispered that maybe we should leave before causing trouble, but something inside me refused to move. I spent my entire life being underestimated because I looked ordinary. I had dirt under my fingernails from decades of work, an old truck, worn boots, and a quiet way of speaking. People assumed poverty meant failure. What none of them knew was that I had built something far larger than appearances. 42 years earlier, I had started a small machine repair business in a rented garage. I worked 16-hour days while Helen kept the books at night after taking care of Daniel. Over decades, that little business grew into a manufacturing company supplying equipment parts across 3 states. But I never cared about luxury. I kept the old truck because it still ran. I wore cheap clothes because I valued comfort over status. When the company became successful, I quietly invested almost everything instead of spending it. By 65, I had more money than most people in that ballroom could imagine, but almost nobody knew because I never spoke about it, especially not to Daniel after he began chasing wealthy circles that valued appearances above character. Vanessa walked away after insulting Helen, satisfied with herself, while nearby guests whispered and stared. I helped my wife sit down near the back of the room, and I watched her try not to cry because she did not want to ruin our son's wedding. That nearly broke me. Then something unexpected happened. An older man across the ballroom suddenly stood up the moment he noticed me. His expression changed from confusion to shock, and he hurried over quickly. It was Arthur Calloway, one of the wealthiest investors in the state and a man whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines. Conversations quieted as he approached because nearly everyone there recognized him. Arthur smiled broadly and reached out both hands to shake mine. "Frank Bennett," he said loudly. "I was hoping you'd come." The entire room turned toward us. Vanessa looked confused. Daniel's eyes widened. Arthur then looked at Helen and greeted her warmly too. "This woman saved your husband's company 30 years ago," he told the people standing nearby. Without Helen's financial planning, Frank would never have built Bennett Industrial into what it is today. I saw Vanessa's confident expression begin cracking. One guest asked cautiously, "Wait, Bennett Industrial? The billion-dollar supplier?" Arthur laughed softly. "Billion-dollar? It crossed that mark 2 years ago." Suddenly, the atmosphere changed completely. Guests who had ignored us minutes earlier began staring with disbelief. Daniel rushed over looking pale. Vanessa's father nearly spilled his drink. Arthur continued talking, unaware of the tension. Frank sold 60% of the company last year. Smartest deal I've seen in decades. Then he looked directly at Daniel and added, "Your father's one of the sharpest businessmen I've ever known." Silence spread through the ballroom like smoke. Vanessa's face turned white. She looked at Helen again, but this time not with disgust. This time with panic. Daniel finally spoke, stumbling over his words, asking why I had never told anyone the full value of the company. I answered calmly that real wealth does not need constant advertisement. Then I looked directly at Vanessa and asked a simple question in front of everyone. "Now that you know who we are, does my wife suddenly belong here?" Nobody spoke. Vanessa tried forcing an apology, but it came out weak and artificial. Helen quietly told her not to bother. I should have left then, but years of swallowing disrespect finally caught up with me. I walked to the center of the ballroom and asked for everyone's attention. The music stopped. Every face turned toward me. I said I had planned to give Daniel and Vanessa a wedding gift that day, something I had spent years preparing. Their expressions immediately brightened with hope. I explained that years ago I created a family trust worth several $1,000,000 that would eventually pass entirely to my son and his future family. I had planned to announce it after the ceremony. Vanessa's father smiled instantly, clearly impressed. But then I continued. I said that wealth means nothing if character is rotten. I told the room that a woman who humiliates another human being for appearing poor has learned nothing about dignity, kindness, or class. I said the greatest embarrassment at this wedding was not our old clothes, but Vanessa's behavior. The silence became unbearable. Daniel stepped forward angrily and said this was not the time for speeches. I looked at him and asked where he had been while his wife insulted his mother. He had no answer. That was the moment I realized I had already lost my son long before that wedding day. Success had made him weak where it mattered most. He protected investors faster than family. He feared social embarrassment more than moral failure. I announced calmly that the trust would not be going to them after all. Gasps spread across the ballroom. Vanessa looked as if the floor disappeared beneath her. Her father immediately began protesting, saying misunderstandings happened and emotions were high. But I ignored him. Instead, I turned toward the hotel staff standing quietly near the walls, people Vanessa had barely acknowledged all evening except to complain. I asked the wedding coordinator for the names of every waiter, cleaner, kitchen worker, and valet present that day. Then I told her I would personally give each employee a generous cash bonus before leaving, because those workers had treated my wife with more respect than the bride did. Some of the staff looked stunned. One elderly waitress began crying softly. Vanessa finally snapped and accused me of trying to ruin her wedding out of spite. I answered that she ruined it herself the moment she mistook money for superiority. Then Helen stood up beside me, still hurt but composed, and said something I will never forget. She looked directly at Vanessa and said, "Poor is temporary. Ugly inside lasts much longer." Not one person disagreed. Daniel begged us privately not to leave because the guests now knew the truth about our wealth, and he feared public humiliation. That sentence alone told me everything. Even then he cared more about appearances than about what his mother felt. So I put my arm around Helen, and together we walked slowly toward the exit while hundreds of wealthy guests watched in silence. But before reaching the doors, Arthur stopped me once more and loudly announced that any man who defended his wife the way I had deserved respect, not ridicule. Several guests actually applauded. Others looked ashamed. Vanessa stood frozen near the stage while whispers spread rapidly through the ballroom. By the next morning, the story had traveled across half the city because rich people gossip faster than anyone. Investors heard about it. Friends heard about it. Even members of Vanessa's social circle turned against her because public cruelty becomes dangerous once exposed. Daniel called me repeatedly over the next few weeks asking to repair things. But I told him reconciliation begins with accountability, not excuses. Months later, he admitted he should have defended his mother immediately regardless of consequences. Whether our relationship will ever fully heal, I still do not know. But I learned something important that day. Many people pretend wealth gives them value, but real character only appears when they believe someone has nothing to offer them. My wife entered that ballroom looking like an ordinary older woman in a simple blue dress, and because of that, people revealed exactly who they truly were. In the end, the richest person in that room was not the one with the designer gown, the luxury cars, or the expensive champagne.